It can be hard to avoid what's going on in the world right now, including for children. With images of war regularly topping the news on TV or online, it can be a concerning and confusing time for kids. If they're exposed to images and stories about conflict and have questions about what it's about, what's the best way to answer them? How young is too young to see images of war? And what happens in conflicts in faraway places crossover into real-world aggression or hate online, at school or in the community? Brad Morgan is the director of Emerging Minds, an Australian organisation which develops mental health policy, interventions and programs and leads the National Workforce Centre for Child Mental Health. Brad, thanks for making time for us today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
First, could you tell us a little more about Emerging Minds and the work that you do?
Yeah, Emerging Minds, we're a national organisation, as you mentioned, focused on mental health in infants, children, young people and their families. And we have this really fantastic job where we get to connect with children and families, service providers and researchers, and we get to learn from them all of the different ways that they're navigating things like mental health challenges and also things that can be quite scary or tough or situations that children and families find themselves in, and really turn that knowledge and information to things that hopefully are helpful and provide guidance to the different people that connect with children and families.
All right. Children, are they more exposed to news about war or conflict these days just because of the ubiquity of our news cycles?
Yes, certainly it isn't just the news in the evening anymore. News is pretty much part of every single environment and context we spend time with. And for many children, that's the environment they've lived in since they were born. And so what we do see now is news and media sort of exposed in every possible scenario. You sort of see it on public transport, we see it in shops, you see it at home, and obviously for some children it's also in their pockets or at school. So certainly the news exposure to these sort of things is pretty prevalent and persistent and pervasive across every part of our lives these days.
All right. And, as we said back in the day, I recall in my parents' era, which included some of the 20th century's worst global events, it was maybe one radio broadcast back then, actually, when they were really young, in the evening, and maybe one newspaper that was days out of date. But it's very hard for any of us at the moment to not be constantly absorbing the stimulus of international conflict.
Yes, definitely. And I think what we are seeing is what has happened with that media is a lot more exposure to who tells the story to us as well. And so we've moved from a time when there's probably a lot more regulation over which news we got, where now that access to media means anyone can tell the story and different stories and different ways of understanding these issues. And unfortunately, with social media and the way that's operating as well, as it does expose or has potential, particularly in things like war and conflict, to expose to more extreme content to keep children and young people and adults actually engaged in the news cycle as well.
What are the main concerns that children have? And we'll talk about some different ages, please, just as we work through. What are the main concerns they have about conflict or war, whether they're seeing images or hearing adults talking about it?
Yeah, well, as you sort of said, it depends really on the ages and stages of children. Probably what I firstly wanted to point out is that for a majority of children, it's actually a healthy and natural reaction for them to feel some concern or worries or sadness or when they see the news about this stuff. So it's actually a healthier reaction that when you see people in pain or in suffering, that you do feel something for it, just like we do as adults. But something that's really important just to be aware of with particularly younger children is they might not be able to distinguish whether that information they're seeing or the news that they're watching, the events they're seeing, whether that's happening in their neighbourhood or whether that's actually on the other side of the world. And so it does have that potential to make them feel unsafe in their context. And that's something that probably is the primary worry you'd be wanting to think about with the news that they're seeing or witnessing.
The other thing is the cumulative effect. We had and again, this is very much in a Western context, let's be honest about that, in our two countries, right? There are conflicts that get far more prominence than conflicts in other parts of the world. But certainly Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but then just what has been unfolding this past year, the growing desperation in Gaza, and imagery that conveys that desperation, and now just the events of the Israel-Iran conflict, and there's a sort of a cumulative effect that builds to a sense of the potential for something cataclysmic, I suppose. And some people speak openly about that, and others are more of a kind of, we've made it this far approach. Do children also imbibe the fact that there are multiple sort of conflicts happening, or do they work in a slightly more linear way? What do we know?
Yeah, well, I think with younger children, it is very hard for them to sort of make sense of this type of information and news. And so generally would recommend limiting exposure to news, particularly for those under sort of 5 or even probably a little bit older than that. But certainly what happens with that cumulative effect, and I think this is sort of what is really important to be curious about with infants and children, is really understanding what are they actually making sense of when they see this, and actually having some questions about that with the children. So things I sort of aware of, and I think you sort of said the cumulative impacts here, is sometimes it can feel a bit cataclysmic, and even as adults we feel that way. And as a consequence, children are possibly likely to feel that way. And so it's a really important point for us to be able to actually talk about what might be happening and where that's happening. And if you're looking at giving information to children, it's sort of asking them around, what do you know about war and conflict? What is it? And for younger children, it can be very simple explanations, such as describing the war as when there's a disagreement between countries, they find it hard to find a way to resolve that. And so as a consequence, sometimes they try to protect themselves or try to end that conflict by using weapons or by engaging in these sorts of things. And so that might be a simple enough explanation for some children, but for others, it's really being genuinely curious and going, what have you witnessed? What have you noticed? And actually having a conversation just like you would with your peers as well, to go, I'm actually really worried about this myself. And that's okay to share that. The reason I'm worried about it are these things. I'm not sure what the future will be, but to be honest about that, but things that I want to sort of think about is, what does this mean for us in our everyday lives? That's the emphasis we try and encourage people to think about, is what does this mean for us every day?
Do you give reassurance also that, we are safe here? And, everyone's hope is that we remain safe here, of course. But do you give reassurance, as you might when there's any difficult discussion, that, it's good to feel for people who might be suffering or sad because of what's happening where they are, but we are safe here? Again, is there an age where that's an important reassurance to give?
Yeah, definitely. So I think reassurance can come in a couple of ways, as you sort of said, pointing out the situation of our local context and what that means. But I think the other thing that's really quite reassuring for children in particular is talking and telling them about the stories of what's being done to help people in those situations as well, or what might be happening for them. So, for example, there might be connection that children and families actually have with people in those conflict zones. And so actually explaining what governments or others and aid agencies are doing to help or figure out ways to help those people is actually quite reassuring. It's that practical assistance of, we have people in our governments whose job it is to find ways to get people home or to find the ways to get them into safer spaces. And these are the types of things they do. So those types of reassurances, those types of advice around the practical things that are happening can actually be really helpful for providing that reassurance.
Or
as well.
Something like we might donate to the doctors who go and help in these places, or something like that, or to those who take food to these places when they can.
Yeah, definitely.
You said something really important, which is that we know children pick up off us. We set the cues. And when we are feeling discombobulated, do we need to be very careful? First, what we're saying within earshot. They reach that age, kids, where you think they can't hear, but they can. In fact, that age is younger, I think, than most of us expect. And also what we convey in terms of our own disposition. Is it important when you are really worried about the latest that that's not what you're physically conveying to your children?
Yeah, definitely. So for younger children, so infants in particular, infants and young children, they really look at our faces. That's what they're tuned into, probably even more so than the television or news. They'd be looking at the faces on the news, but they're going to be looking to your face or adults' faces around them to get a sense of, am I in a safe space at the moment? And so if you're feeling quite distressed just by witnessing the news, ways that you can sort of help them navigate that is just to find ways to be calming and reassuring. So probably turn off the news in the first place, but then actually do something calming and help them feel like they're in a safe space again. And that's just through the way you react with them. And then with older children, you pointed out some really important things there of children. I pretty much just go assume the kids are listening and hear what you're talking about. And so when you're mindful of that, it's actually thinking about the messages you convey to each other as adults. It might be you involve children in those discussions, but it might also be thinking about what you put emphasis on in the way you're talking about this. Certainly, what does tend to pop up, particularly war and conflict, is discussions around race and discrimination can pop up quite a bit. And so, something we really encourage you to think about is how can you communicate in ways that encourage compassion. And so think about things like talking about, oh, it's really tricky for those families that are feeling unsafe in those areas at the moment. It must be really scary, rather than necessarily going into the politics of those situations. You sort of really want to encourage that compassion, um, so that children get a sense of, I guess, avoiding what can often happen in these situations is, increasing our sense of separation that can come in these areas, particularly in places in Australia and New Zealand where we have a lot of connections across those different areas as well.
All right. Do you voluntarily talk with children or wait until they have questions or comments about what they're seeing? At what age might you want to have the conversation, or should you always, because you don't know what they're thinking, right? Or you don't know what they're saying with others. But do you do it proactively, or do you wait for a cue?
Generally, I would trust a judgment here just on what you know they have or have witnessed. I think probably, as we said before, probably assume that they have seen something, but note that children often try to protect even their parents from their own worries. They don't want to worry others. And so I tend to encourage just being curious and asking, have you seen? I think like sort of using that sort of script I've been watched, lots of news has popped up this week about this. Have you seen anything pop up? And then that just invites some conversations to go, oh, yeah, I did see something that's happening overseas and some more. And then that gives you then a sense of an invitation to have that conversation. And then through that conversation, you can invite and say, yeah, it's a bit worrying, isn't it? And encourage them to sort of share some of their worries just by you sharing some of yours. So really, I'll just say be proactive and start the conversation if you can, based on what you know, but just assume that kids will probably try to protect you as well from their worries.
What about older children who might be starting to form strong views on things? I think what you were to earlier is that there's no winners in war, right? And we can have long conversations about the justification for such conflicts, and
Yeah.
we're probably not going to get into them now. But if they're starting to issue opinions on one side versus t'other, or on justifications or whatever, what's the nature of the conversation you might have them to help them with their critical thinking and to help them with I guess with your own values in this situation as well?
Well, I'd say this is actually, it's a good question. Actually, really, I view this as reciprocal because quite often children and young people are actually talking about these things to sense what your values and opinions are as well. And so view those as opportunities. These are opportunities to actually talk about things together. And I think quite often we get concerned, and we should be concerned about what types of extreme sort of information children, young people are getting access to. But a colleague of mine actually said they did some work in a previous role where they actually interviewed children around news exposure. And it was actually children who said they were really, young people said they were really concerned about their parents' engagement with even extremist content and what that means. And so I think from a parent or an adult entry point, opening up that conversation enables you to understand where they're coming from, introduce different ideas, and if they're being exposed to extreme content as well that you find quite disagreeable as a parent, actually, even though you might find it hard to swallow, can you show that to me? I want to sit down with you and watch that so we can have a bit of a chat about why that information's been given in that way and who's giving that information. You use it a bit of a way to what we call media literacy, which is unpacking who's telling this story and why they're telling it in this way. So that's something we do encourage, is that engaging in this together, and criticizing and being critical and using that as an opportunity to be critical of the way information is being presented as well.
Well, interestingly, you have to check your own biases, right? And it may be you're the one who's conveying the bias in the situation. So
Exactly,
you
yeah.
need to think about the conversation that you're having here. That sense of, something cataclysmic. I've told this story so many times. Sorry to bore you again with it, listeners, but, I was a child of the 70s and the Cold War, and I distinctly remember just thinking I'll never get to grow up and have kids. I never dwelt on that or got depressed about that, but it was a different era. Like you'd think, oh, this terrible thing's going to happen, and then you just go, like we were saying earlier, and just get on with the rest of your day. Whereas for kids these days, as it is for all of us, the stimulus is just so continuous. That sense of hopelessness or helplessness, and I mean, climate change is kind of a factor in this as well. You do notice an incredible resilience amongst many young people, but are there others for whom you really need to talk and say, look, this is not the first time the world has been in a really difficult place. In fact, there's not many times when it hasn't been. And, again, bring the focus back to your own environment, your own people, your own being your own sort of best person you can be, and just pulling back from that big picture. What happens when they really start to get quite negative about their prospects?
Well, I think we've all probably had that. I was sort of in the generation of the September 11 when that kicked off. I remember that I was in high school when that happened as well, and that sort of persisted for years and years. That sort of dialogue, and it did have a real disruptive sense. And I think um, with those sorts of events, and obviously, as you sort of said, that really long-term issues that keep being exposed to us, I think just as you said there, is actually sharing those experiences that you had to say these are, when I was younger, these are the types of things that happened. And, I had some really big worries about my future and the world's future. But what you can talk about as part of that story were the things that happened in that show that hope can be maintained, that there were actions that were taken, there were consequences to those things, but in everyday life, things were able to recover and develop again. And so, sort of framing these things as, I guess, waves of issues that pop up. Some of them are big, some of them are smaller, but they do change and they do settle. But alongside of that, I think you pointed out a thing there as well around it's quite, particularly with media now, is it's hard to switch off. And so that's even for adults. We find it hard when there's content that is designed to make us engage with it and becomes more and more extreme. It makes us more worried. And by doing that, we engage and try and, I guess, sort of make sense of things that are sometimes quite hard to make sense of. And so sometimes it is about setting some limits on the way we
Yeah.
use that content
I mean,
and
September
finding
11th
ways
was
to recover from it.
it was the classic
Mm,
example, wasn't it, Brad? Because that image of the towers falling was just replayed 24/7, and our poor nervous
mm,
systems can't tell the difference between the first time and the next time. They're still seeing the same thing. So actually limiting your own obsession with what are really worrying times, but limiting your own intake will probably actually potentially assist you with trying to watch out what's happening with the kids as well. But also we
yeah,
know that as humans, and this is one of the overwhelming challenges of our times, we're designed to what? We're designed to have relationships with about 150 people, not 1.5 billion on your Insta. And anything that brings us back to our local environment. It doesn't mean that you don't care and you don't have an interest in or an opinion on what's happening globally, but just trying to bring everybody back to the things that are real in their lives day to day can help kids as well. Like, footy practice, let's go, or whatever, or let's
yeah,
make a really nice meal
yeah,
together. Those sorts of things.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think that's that moderation. And we all have different ways. And I think even as adults, sort of talking about, I'm feeling really agitated by this or a bit things, I think I need to go do something. And actually inviting children, what do you do when you're feeling a bit worried or finding you're a bit struggling with things? What things help you? So it sort of invites them to sort of problem solve, but also by you sort of saying, I need some assistance to navigate these things, that sort of gives permission to them that it's actually okay that we have these reactions to these things. So certainly finding those things, like you said, let's just go for a walk, let's go to the shops, do whatever, because we need some disconnection time as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Brad Morgan is Director of Emerging Minds.